Howdy. Welcome back. Get the last stragglers into the door. And those of you on the screen, welcome back. Just as a reminder, this is our Staff Development Day, in case you haven't been with us for the first two presentations. We're in the middle of a great day. We've got some great speakers lined up. We have another one coming up here now. We do, in case you haven't looked at the schedule, we do have a networking lunch immediately after this presentation, and I'll give you a little bit more detail after that, and then we'll come back again with the next presentation starting at 1:30. So we have a great afternoon of speakers lined up for that day, for that time as well. So everybody looks like they're hyped up. You got some caffeine. Everybody's good, ready to go. Great. So our next speaker is Dr. Stephen Courtright, and he joins us from the Mays Business School, which I have a heart for that since I was there about 30 years ago, working through some of those classes as well. He is a Presidential Impact Fellow and an award-winning teacher. His research primarily focuses on bad bosses and dysfunctional teams. My boss is not here now, so I can say, can we talk? Just kidding. She's great. And what organizations can do to prevent both of these things. He is an accomplished researcher, and his work is widely published in leading journals and major news publications. Most importantly, he and his wife Nicole are the proud parents of 4 wonderful and rambunctious children, his words. So today, Dr. Courtright will discuss becoming a leader, avoiding pitfalls, and maximizing opportunities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Courtright.
Well, thank you, Scott, for that generous introduction there. I always enjoy the little bit of laughter that happens when it's said what I actually study, bad bosses and dysfunctional teams. I think the biggest laughter is from my students who are saying, that's him, actually. So, no, in actuality, I do enjoy this topic. I'll discuss that a little bit before I go. I will just say, first of all, to Mary and Scott and the team, thank you for inviting me to participate in this, and thank you for allowing me to just be a part of your work day today for 40 minutes. As I follow President Young and then also a Hall of Fame athlete, it kind of reminds me of the story where the farmer enrolls his donkey in the Kentucky Derby, and one of the administrators of the race says, "Don't you realize that you don't stand a chance to win?" And he says, "Oh, I'm not here to win. I just want him to enjoy some good company." And that's kind of how I feel. And I'm sure that's what Mary was thinking when she invited me to do this in the first place. So he just needs some good company. So, as Scott noted in my introduction, I do teach at Mays Business School here at Texas A&M. I've been here for 6 years now. Have enjoyed every minute of it, and now bleed maroon, never having even really been to the state of Texas before I came here as a professor. So I am a born-again Aggie, if you will, and truly enjoy being here. As I have gone through my career, I should start off by saying my original background is actually in accounting. And once I kind of got tired of debits and credits and tax deductions and tax credits, I decided that what I was really interested in was human behavior at work. I've always been an observer of people. I love sitting in public places and just watching human behavior. And once I figured out that I could actually get paid to study human behavior and then teach about it, I thought this is a slam dunk. And so I went in and I went to do my doctoral program at the University of Iowa. And while I was there, I struggled to communicate what exactly I do, which is the case with a lot of us in our jobs when we're trying to communicate to somebody. I had this kinds of experiences when I first started. I would be sitting next to a stranger on an airplane. They say, "What do you do?" I say, "Well, I'm an organizational psychologist." Well, that's a great way for the person to put in their earbuds and never talk to you again as you're on the flight. So I thought, well, maybe that's not the most engaging way to describe what I do for work. So I just kind of shifted things around a bit. And I said, well, I teach at a business school. And then the problem with that is that I get all sorts of questions about the current GDP and things, which I probably had as much knowledge as they did, given my specialization. And suddenly I looked like that my university wasn't particularly credible when I couldn't answer the ins and outs of the financial markets. And so I thought, well, how do I really frame this? Well, as I went through my doctoral program, what I figured out that I was really interested in was bad bosses and dysfunctional teams. I don't know why I've been interested in that. The positive side of leadership, which I have researched and which I do teach, is really interesting. But for some reason, the dark side of leadership is far more interesting. I don't know if that's because I always played the villain in childhood games, or if that was because maybe I was doing a little bit of me search, or what exactly it was. But I started telling people that I study bad bosses and dysfunctional teams. Now, when I do that, the reaction that I get is almost always universally the same. I always get a story about a bad boss. And as I hear the little bit of a laughter going on here, I'm sure I could collect hundreds of stories from you all. Well, so what I really found out why this is even cooler to study bad bosses happened a couple years ago when my daughter invited me to her first grade class for a career day. She really wanted me to come, and I just thought, I'm following, first of all, a firefighter, a police officer, all the people who are cool to my kids, and then comes in this professor. And I thought, how am I ever going to explain what I do to a group of first graders? And so I came in, I was thinking about this a lot and how to frame it, and I just decided, you know what, I'm just going to talk about bad bosses like I always do. And so I go and I say, well, kids, I teach at Texas A&M. And of course, the first thing you want to talk to me about is the football team. So which I can talk about all day. So we start talking about the football team a little bit, and I say, okay, let's get down to business. And here's what I actually do at Texas A&M. No, I don't know Kevin Sumlin at the time. No, I don't know. I did teach Trevor Knight in class. They thought that was the coolest thing in the presentation. Probably the only thing they took away from it, frankly. But then I said, well, so let me tell you a little bit about what I study. I said, I teach business students not to be bad bosses. And I like to study what makes bad bosses bad bosses. Now, to my absolute amazement, about half the students raised their hands in class and said, my mom has a bad boss, or my dad has a bad boss. And I thought, now I have a cool job in the eyes of a first grader. So here's a couple things that I discovered from that and other experiences in talking about bad bosses. First of all, it's really eye-opening to me that a first grader can describe bad boss behavior. But what's amazing to me, even more than that, is that they actually can describe it in great detail. So it makes me a little scared. This is the second thing I've learned. It makes me a little scared what I say at home for fear what my kids are going to say about me when they get to school. The filters aren't quite developed yet in first grade. But I think what I just learned is that most people have had or experienced or have been a bad boss at one point in time. So my overarching question that I study and research is not necessarily what makes bad bosses bad bosses. We have plenty of examples of that. We could go on and on all day. There's a few examples I'll just show here that I like to say. By the way, that's a picture of me at my daughter's first grade. I forgot to show that there at career day. We have the micromanagement type of bad boss, okay? This is one form of bad boss behavior that I especially love to study. Maybe in part because it's so universal, unfortunately, and in some part because it's so easy to fall into. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Here's the other type of boss, not as quite as funny, but the verbally berative and abusive boss. Now, hopefully this isn't as common. However, surveys done on the North American workforce indicate that at least 15% of people report, and that's a key word, report, that they have a verbally abusive boss. Well, here's the dangers in both of these styles of leadership, if you will. Lots and lots of research, not just by myself, but by many, many other researchers at other institutions. If you're micromanaged, you tend to experience greater burnout. You tend to feel less trusted. You tend to have lower levels of job satisfaction, lower levels of commitment to the organization, and eventually, over time, anyway, lower performance. Now, you can get somebody to get things done through a micromanagement style in the short term. The long run is where the research does not support the efficacy of micromanaging type of behavior. But the effects of verbal abuse go beyond even that. For example, research has shown that victims of abusive supervision can go home and oftentimes are hostile towards their own family members. they engage in what we kind of call, and what researchers have called, a kick the dog phenomenon, where they experience stress at work because of a boss, and then when they get home, the dog's jumping on them, so happy to see them, they might kick it out of just sheer frustration, okay? Unfortunately, what we've also found is that that dog could also potentially be a child, or it could be a spouse. It could also be that rather than being verbally abusive, research has shown that victims of abusive supervision engage in more problem drinking. They're more given to alcoholism as a result. Researchers have discovered so many ill effects of verbally abusive behavior that we have really termed it a significant social problem. So that's sort of just laying out these two types of various different types of bad boss behavior, if you will, and some of the consequences. But that's not really what I'm interested in studying, because I've discovered something else through both my own leadership and by teaching many executives and many different students and talking with people a lot about what I research. Here's the interesting that I find. Most people, in fact, I've never met a single person that you talk to goes into a boss position and says, my goal is to be the worst boss ever. My goal is to be the kind of boss that my first grade kid tells a complete stranger about. Or I'm the kind of person that I hope that I will be talked about on an airplane. No one really goes into a leadership position and has that kind of goal, but it happens. So why? Why does that happen? Well, there's a number of different explanations that research has given for this and that I've tried to study myself in my career to some extent. Let me give you just a few of these. For example, there are just some personality traits that incline someone to behave in this way. Narcissistic behavior and personality tendencies, for example. More Machiavellianism, as they call it, which is the desire to achieve ends at the expense of means. Other types of psychopathy, sociopathy, other type of psychological and other traits predispose individuals to behave this way. That's one theory. The evidence, however, is pretty mixed. To some extent, they predict bad boss behaviors, but the correlations are small enough across studies to suggest that it doesn't entirely paint the whole picture. It explains part of it, a minor part of it, but not all of it. So then researchers said, okay, so what else besides a person's personality traits might make them a bad boss? Again, the kind of boss that a first grader might tell a stranger about. Well, in some cases, there might be certain individuals who are different from the boss, different in personality, even different in demographic, and they might kind of, from a bullying perspective, be picked out of the group to be abused. Or, in the case of micromanagement, perhaps they're new, perhaps they're low on ability, perhaps maybe they're less capable, or whatever it might be, and sometimes we sort of pick and choose how we behave towards certain individuals, okay? Now, in the case of verbal abuse, that's something that we would call moral exclusion. In other words, because people are different than us, we may exclude them from our moral circle, our moral sphere, and so we justify verbal abuse against those individuals. Research has found that has supported that. Another theory is that kind of what I call a monkey see, monkey do type of theory, which is that if you've had experience working for an abusive boss in the past, then somehow we get it ingrained in our minds that that's how we're supposed to lead. The same thing works with micromanagement as well. In other words, people's leadership styles become imprinted on us, and we essentially mimic those styles. That can extend beyond that, by the way. There's also research to suggest that individuals who grow up in more hostile environments and homes may also be more predisposed to engaging in these types of behaviors as well. Or those that were raised in more helicopter homes might be more prone toward helicopter type of leadership as well. That's another theory. One theory that I've tested out, mainly because I have 4 children and I'm really interested in the intersect between family and work, is the influence the family has on behavior. I have a study, for example, that I published a couple of years ago that found that family problems can translate into abusive behavior at work under certain conditions. Mainly because family problems seep us of our energy And when we have nothing left to bring to work and we have no energy, essentially our psychological and verbal filters go down and we're more likely to abuse as a result. So family problems can sometimes be a cause of abusive behavior. And the list could probably go on and on. There's certainly more research that is being done and that can be done to try to answer this question of why bad bosses are bad bosses. What I want to present to you today, however, is less about these more external factors or personality factors and dig a little bit into the mindset. What is the mindset of a micromanager? What is the mindset of a verbally abusive boss? Mindsets are probably the most proximal thing that we have to behavior. Mindsets about the roles that we have as leaders, about what it means to be a leader, about what kind of outcomes we're trying to achieve as a leader. Our beliefs and our assumptions about leadership really end up driving our behavior. So what I'll do today is I'll present, and this goes along with the theme that we have today of encourage, engage, empower. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of power and how we view power and how that influences the way that we behave toward others as leaders. What I hope to present today are some false assumptions that can underlie our leadership that, if changed, can help us to be more inspiring leaders, more engaging leaders, more encouraging leaders, and specifically, especially for today, more empowering leaders. Let's talk about what these mindsets are. Linda Hill is a professor at Harvard Business School who's done a number of different studies looking especially at brand new leaders. She has done work looking at the transition from going to a more individual contributor role to a managerial role, and the taxing transition that really is from a career and a life perspective. In her research, she has discovered a number of different mindsets that new leaders have that can sometimes underlie the behaviors that we've discussed so far. Let me present to you what some of these mindsets are. Bottom line is they all revolve around mindsets regarding our power in a leadership position. Perhaps, for example, we've stepped into a leadership role before and we've said these kinds of things to ourselves. Now that I'm the boss, I'll have the freedom to implement my ideas. Now that I'm the boss, I'll finally get the respect that I have always deserved. Now that I'm the boss, people will finally listen to me and to what I have to say. And they'll do what I say as well. Now that I'm the boss, I'll finally be on top of the ladder. These may be things that we very subtly tell ourselves when we go into a leadership position. All these assumptions, and what I'll say when we talk about subtly, I'm talking about very unconsciously even thinking about these things and thinking about leadership positions this way. What these assumptions do is they all revolve around bad beliefs about what it means to have power in a leadership position. Let me give an example. Let's go with this first one here. I will have the freedom to implement my ideas. Anybody who has become a boss quickly finds out that rather than having all the freedom to implement your ideas, you're a little bit of a hostage at first, okay? There's a hostage situation here. And sometimes we got to call in the hostage specialist, okay? Maybe that's an upper boss, maybe that's a consultant, maybe that's going to a staff development day or something like that, okay? But we quickly find out a lot of times after we get in a leadership position that while we thought we would have more freedom, we actually feel more constrained than we did previously. Why do we go into a leadership position thinking that I'll have the freedom to implement my ideas? It's because we view leadership as a position of mainly through the lens of formal power. We mainly view leadership as a way to get things done, and that because of our position, that we'll be able to get things done. That's what this kind of assumption underlies, is that leadership is a formal position. My message for you today is formal position is management. Leadership is something entirely different from that. Leadership is influence. Leadership is credibility. Leadership is trust. Leadership is getting people to do things because they actually want to, not just because you pull out the boss card and tell them, you or I pull out the boss card and tell them, do it because I'm the boss. That's management. So today we're focused on becoming a leader. And again, our fixation, even subtly, on formal authority can trip us up early. Now, this plays a role in the next part where we say, I will finally get the respect that I deserve. Again, through a management lens, we believe that the respect comes by holding a formal position in the hierarchy. And to some extent, that is true. As it is also true to some extent that when we hold a management position, we do have more latitude than we did before, potentially, to implement some of our ideas. At least a little bit more formal authority to back us. But again, what underlies this assumption is that leadership is a formal position. And then what we end up doing is leaning on our formal authority to get things done. In reality, what managers find out very quickly, hopefully anyway, is that people don't do things because we're the boss. In fact, people don't do things sometimes because we're the boss, if you've ever had an experience like that. I'm an academic. Professors do that all the time. So sometimes we don't do things purposefully because somebody is pulling out the boss card. And in a sense, when somebody uses formal authority and assumes that formal authority is what gets us the respect that they deserve, sometimes it can even feel a little bit immoral to us. It can feel like that it inhibits my own personal sense of freedom, my own agency that I have to make choices. Sometimes it can do just that, and it can just feel wrong to us. Well, that same assumption that leadership is about formal position underlies the next one we have there. People will finally listen to me and do what I say. Again, formal authority makes that assumption. We're not about formal authority in leadership. In fact, the more that we use formal authority, the more likely we are to someday lose that formal authority, is at least what research would suggest. And so, rather than leaning on formal authority, we lean on informal authority. Instead, then, of being fixated on, I'm finally at the top of the ladder, we view leadership roles in a very different way. We view them as an opportunity to serve rather than as an indicator of status. That is the mindset of an effective boss, is one who views the leadership position, again, not as an indicator of status, but as an opportunity for service. So to summarize, what are the assumptions that sometimes underlie bad boss behavior? It's the assumption that we'll get things done because of formal authority, and it's the assumption that status is attached to leadership. Now, these are half-truths. There is some truth to them. However, if we lead by formal authority and with status as our backing, again, we are more likely to lose that formal authority and that status. So, what do we do? What do we do to curtail bad boss behavior? Well, the first part, like any type of change, personal change, is we recognize these in ourselves. Here's the scary part of having these assumptions. As I said before, they can be relatively benign. They can be very subtle. They can be very unconscious. And so what we have to do is think about, are we saying these things in our mind about our leadership role? Are we automatically assuming, for example, when we're getting a project done, that my formal authority will back this up? We have to kind of assess ourselves, check ourselves, if you will, to see if we have any of these assumptions. I can tell you from my own experience, I have absolutely had that happen sometimes before. And I have even heard it come out of my mouth, mainly in private. Hopefully, I teach this stuff, so I should be able to recognize it a little bit, that I am leaning on my formal authority to get such and such person to do this or such and such person to do that. So we have to check ourselves. So we check ourselves to see if those assumptions. But then the scary part, too, is just how prone we are as human beings to think about power through a formal authority lens. I have a good friend of mine, a good researcher who is at the University of Maryland. We actually tried to hire him here, and then he turned us down for the University of Maryland. But he did a study looking at how easy it is for people to be fixated on formal authority, irregardless of personality differences. Some people tend to be more power hungry, but this is independent of those, controlling for those, if you will. So he did a few interesting experiments. Each morning, he would give a bit of an anecdote to the participants in the survey. They participated for about a 2-week period each day, filling out some surveys and reading some anecdotes about leaders. In one of the conditions that he set up in his research study, he tried to induce feelings of power. And he did that very subtly by having people read about powerful people. Also, by even subliminally putting power on the computer screens. And what he found is on those days when people were induced to feel power, they were more likely to exercise power in ways that are not productive, such as, in his case, verbal abuse. On those days, they were affected by it. On other days, when they weren't induced with those types of power inducements, they tended to, on average, have lower levels of abusive supervision. So even just stories of power and powerful people, anecdotes about them, just thinking about it can cause us unknowingly, unwittingly, to exercise power in less than effective ways. So we need to check ourselves, but we also need to understand how subtle these types of feelings of power are. And also realize that power is not just a position, power is a feeling. There's other research suggesting that regardless of whether they have a formal position, if someone is made to feel like they have power, they tend to be domineering in their group, they tend to not be as open to other ideas, and they tend to stifle creativity as a result. Even if they don't have a formal power position, just the feeling of power can do that. And so we have to think about our leadership roles not as indicators of status and power, but opportunities to serve. We have to think less about getting things done through formal authority and more about getting things done through trust, through credibility. Thinking like this: instead of thinking that now I have the freedom to implement my ideas, thinking along these lines: I will need to create a web of good relationships with people. I need to pay attention to relationships and not just tasks, in other words. Or instead of saying, now that I'm the boss, people will respect me, we say to ourselves, now I really need to earn the trust of those that I'm leading, to strategically and purposefully engage in trust-building exercises. Now, I'm not talking about the fall backwards type of trust exercise or the rope exercises. In reality, research shows those actually have very little efficacy. So I'm actually suggesting more along the lines of just building relationships and showing warmth. One of the easiest ways to build trust, the research would show, is just to show genuine interest in those that we lead, to find similarities, and to give genuine praise to others for good work, for good efforts, and for good outputs. Those are just everyday common ways to build trust. That's the type of mindset that replaces what we talked about earlier. Instead of thinking that, well, now that I'm the boss, I can finally get things done, we'll say that I'm going to need to lean on the trust that I build with people to get things done. And finally, instead of just saying, as we said in the earlier slide, I'll be on top of the ladder, we now say, instead, I really need to get people's buy-in. I'm one with the team, okay? We are in this together. And I'm not just looking for compliance, I'm looking for buy-in. I'm looking for commitment. We can get compliance in the short term, no problem. But that's not really what gets the job done in the long run. What we're really looking for is commitment. So how do we do that? Instead of fixating on formal power, even subtly, instead we do the opposite. After we have these mindsets, we actually empower other people. As we have this kind of mindset here, the creation of a web of good relationships, as we earn people's trust, when we realize that it has to be earned, it's not just given. As we lean on that trust to get things done, as we say that we'll need people's buy-in, not just their compliance, this kind of leadership style actually flows very, very naturally. It doesn't have to be forced. It flows very naturally. Here's some things that happen when we have those mindsets that deal with empowering others. When we view our position less on formal authority and less about me as a leader, we actually tend to have a more natural level of trust in those that we lead. And instead of distrusting and being proven wrong, we trust first and then we're proven wrong if that's the case. So we kind of reverse the order. there in terms of trusting others. And then as we trust others, we're also more willing to delegate, but with certain boundaries, okay? Delegating doesn't mean giving up formal authority. It means delegating authority. Delegating is not the same always as giving up, because after all, we all know the buck stops with us, okay? But it does mean giving some latitude, autonomy, and decision-making authority to those that we lead. The research on this is abundantly positive on this style of leadership. People who feel that they are empowered by their leaders have higher job satisfaction, higher job performance, more commitment to the organization, more commitment to the leader, higher creativity, more levels of innovation in the group, and the list goes on and on. This is a relatively positive, almost universally positive style of leadership. And so we delegate. However, we also can give some boundaries. One study showed, I actually did a study on this a couple of years ago. We did a study in manufacturing teams. And we wanted to look at leaders who empowered their teams, but then didn't give their teams any feedback along the way in terms of how they were actually doing on their performance. What we found is that teams that were high on autonomy, in other words, had a lot of freedom and felt they had freedom, but received very little coaching or feedback from employees, were actually the worst performing teams in our sample. The reason why? Because they didn't know what they were supposed to have freedom for. They could have freedom, they just didn't know what they were supposed to do with it. On the other hand, those that had leaders who both gave autonomy and then also coached and gave feedback and support and information along the way had the highest levels of performance in our sample. Why? Because they had a clear idea of what they were to aim for. They had a clear idea of what their freedom was for. So delegating doesn't mean being a laissez-faire leader. Delegation is a very strategic style of leadership that gives people freedom and autonomy, harnesses people's creativity and motivation, while also giving people a clear target to shoot for without standing over their shoulders like the boss we saw earlier in there and asking them to hyphenate micromanagement. Okay? So as we adopt a proper mindset, we're more likely to delegate. Second, empowering leaders keep their focus on the team. What empowering leaders do is rather than, as we talked about earlier, sort of picking and choosing who they actually empower to, they look for every opportunity to empower the team as a whole, okay? They look to build teamwork, not just to manage one-on-one relationships. Now, they can use one-on-one relationships to help build the team, but they don't use one-on-one relationships as the end. It's a stepping stone toward managing and building the team as a whole. Empowering leaders keep their focus on the team. Then finally, an empowering leader, one who has the mindsets that we talked about earlier, is more likely to create a culture of listening and transparency of information as well. You see, the hoarding of information is actually, unless it is absolutely dictated that we shouldn't share that information, which sometimes that can even be questioned, okay? Sometimes we hoard information because it makes us feel more powerful, okay? Information and knowledge is actually power. It enhances that feeling of power. So the more that we're willing to share information with the team and to be transparent with them, the more empowering that we are viewed as leaders by the people that work for us. But we only get the best information when we also are willing to listen to others. As I said earlier, one of the studies that I love in our field showed that those who feel powerful are less likely to listen. They're less likely to take in ideas. And when we do that, we not just put our own leadership in peril, but we stifle creativity and innovation when we don't listen to other people's ideas. Moreover, we actually make life a lot harder for ourselves, because then the team comes to depend on us for those creative and innovative ideas, rather than the team working together as a whole. So this is empowering leadership. Now, we could talk about this all day. We teach 16-week seminars on this in the business school, okay? So this is a little bit of a drop in the ocean, if you will. But the reason why I presented this today, again, going along with the staff development theme, is that empower isn't just this catchy phrase. It's not just this buzzword. It actually has a a very robust science behind it. That when people feel empowered by their bosses, And when bosses actively try to empower their followers, that you get the outcomes that you're looking for, both short-term and long-term. We also avoid, as I said earlier, being the boss that our first grader talks about when they go to school to a complete stranger. So as you leave today, as you think about becoming a leader and avoiding pitfalls and maximizing opportunities, I would just invite you to consider the ways that power influences us in our leadership. Evaluate the way that we might have been leaning too much on formal authority, the way that we might have been equating leadership with status and power instead of opportunity to serve. And then from there, shift our mindset to what it really means to be a leader, what kind of impact we're trying to have, what kind of outcomes we're trying to get. Again, not just compliance, but commitment. And then from there, adopt the mindsets that we had here that really, in essence, help us to become more empowering leaders, and doing that by trusting, by delegating, by sharing information, by building relationships, focusing on the team, and listening to others. Research would suggest, and I think our own experience suggests, that that will be the kind of boss that somebody might talk about your back behind that's good. That's hopefully the boss that we can be. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Courtright. And we have about 10 minutes or so for questions, and I know that everybody has a question, I'm sure, because you're all thinking about that person in your head that he was describing. So, again, let's wait for the microphones to come, but if you have a question, please.
A different take on what you presented, but very real for most of us in this place that are not in official leadership positions. What advice do you give for staff who have that bad boss?
Yes, great question. It's the question that I probably get most frequently, honestly, even from bosses, okay? Because bosses, after all, they're not just managing downward, they're managing upward too. So how do you actually deal with that boss? Well, there's a couple of things, okay? The first thing, and what I will say at the outset is this: I try to respond to as many questions as I can from a scientific, evidence-based perspective. You're going to find plenty of books with lots of good anecdotes that can help you with this. One is Managing Up, actually by Linda Hill, that professor at Harvard Business School. There's a great one called, and I won't use the exact word, but the No A-Hole Rule by Bob Sutton, who's a professor at Stanford. Fantastic book for addressing those kinds of questions as well. What I will simply say is this: sometimes it requires a nice heart-to-heart with your manager, because here's the issue. Most managers don't even realize they're doing that. I've had a conversation with managers before. Now, some do, and some are purposeful about that, but a lot really don't. So I've had to have conversations with bosses before where I have said, listen, you can trust me with this, okay? I haven't let you down before. I'm not going to let you down now. You can trust me with it. Please don't micromanage. I don't work well under micromanagement. Sometimes a heart-to-heart talk like that can do wonders, okay? Sometimes a heart-to-heart talk like this. Even if you're a boss, for example, you have a formal leadership position, and your boss might want you to be a micromanager because he or she is a micromanager. Sometimes you might have to have a conversation, say, I need you to be comfortable with the fact that I'm not like you. The results will get done, the things will get done, but I'm not exactly like you. And so I need you to be comfortable with that. And if you're not, then we need to have that conversation, okay? I have found in my experience that having those types of open conversations with the bosses can be pretty productive, actually. And that what the boss ends up usually finding out about themselves is they don't know that they're actually making life hard for you. They think you're making life easier. They think they're making life easier for you. This goes back again to just kind of the overarching assumption behind my research. Most bosses don't walk into a role saying, I want to be the micromanaging or the verbally abusive boss that my kids talk about to a stranger. But it happens. So many of us are accidental bad bosses. So having that kind of frank conversation with them it will be something that's hopefully helpful for you. That's one of several recommendations. Again, those books might be helpful for you as well. So thank you. Great question. Other questions?
So there's one back here and then one right over here.
Okay, I have kind of a two-part question.
Yeah.
It's okay. So first of all, how much of the bad boss situation is because of the organization promoting someone who is excellent into a leadership position with no leadership experience? And then second, how much of this translates down to our students so that we can help them become effective leaders?
Great questions. Let me address the first one there. This is something I discuss with my students. Actually, I teach in the MS-HR program here at Texas A&M, and we talk a lot about identifying high potential leaders and talking about what is it that makes someone a potential leader in such and such role. One of the biggest mistakes that organizations make is exactly what you mentioned there. We call it the performance potential paradox. That we assume that because someone has been a high performer in their role, that they will then be a boss, a great boss. The problem is that the skills of an individual contributor are so vastly different from being a leader. And so many of the bad boss problems that we have in organizations stem from that potential performance paradox, absolutely. And so really then what that requires of organizations, and this is something again that we teach our HR students, that we work with organizations on, even in our Center for Executive Development, working with organizations on this in the business school, is you really have to have a robust definition, a competency model of what it is that you want your leaders to have. What are the competencies that you want them to have? And most of the time, you'll have one or two of them be more technical skills, and the rest of them are human skills or strategic thinking, conceptual skills that you want leaders to have. You figure out ways to measure those competencies, and then you, through various development exercises, through observation, through 360-degree feedback that happens, you get an assessment of whether a leader has those competencies, and the extent to which they have those competencies, the more likely that they are to be promoted to that role. That helps in parts, not the perfect solution. There's no perfect solution to this problem because we're humans. There's human error in all of our judgments when we do that. But that's one more kind of robust way to try to prevent the performance paradox, the performance potential paradox. Now to your second question. How does that bleed down in the way that we teach our students? We have to teach our students, and not just our students, we have to teach, in my opinion, as a father of 4 children, I have to teach my children that leadership is not status. Leadership is service. And so I find kids do that all the time. When you're running for student council, for example, so much of the time it's because status, okay? So I talk to my kids and we just say, it's not about status, it's about service. What do you do to serve? What are you trying to do to serve? We have to do the same thing with our students too. In other words, we have to redefine the leadership role for our students, and we have to redefine it for our kids as well. And the earlier we do that, the better. The earlier we develop the mindset that leadership is not about formal authority, but about informal authority and building trust and credibility. And the earlier that we talk to them about leadership not as status, but as service, the more likely we are to see changes in that regard. So I absolutely think it affects our curriculum, our pedagogy, our competency models that we form. We have to redefine leadership. And that's going to take reversing about thousands of years of how we view leadership. It's not going to happen all at once. But in our little corners of the earth, whether that's in our work groups, whether that's in our families, whether that's in our nonprofits, our churches, whatever, that's one place where we can help to redefine leadership.
Great. Another.
Dr. Courtright, I have a question for you. For those of us in the room who might be thinking maybe we have some of those tendencies or traits that you talked about as a bad boss.
Yeah.
I have a few staff members in here. Hopefully they are not thinking that of me, but if they are, what advice do you have? What's one thing that we could do to turn the ship around as quickly as possible?
Yeah. Here's the thing. What this requires, and what we've seen with accidental bosses, generally revolves around a lack of awareness of how people actually view us as leaders. So actually, really the first step is to figure out, in the eyes of our subordinates, are we actually engaging in these types of behaviors? Now, there's a number of ways in which to do that. You could do a survey, a 360-degree survey. You could ask that independently of that. It's kind of like during the middle of the semester, I might survey my students and say, how am I doing on teaching? Are you getting something out of this? What am I doing that you like? What am I doing that you don't like? Those kinds of surveys like that can be helpful, but also just one-on-one conversations with them. You showing a little bit, and all of us showing a little bit of vulnerability to be able to say, where do I lack in my leadership, is a tough conversation to have. It's tough for the individual receiving the feedback, and often, and sometimes it can even be tougher for the person giving the feedback. But the more that you create that sense of vulnerability for yourself, and the more that you make yourself open to what others have to say, the more that you can at least do a diagnostic test, if you will, to see how you're doing. There's really no curing it until we've diagnosed it first. And so there's self-diagnosis. That's kind of what I talked about in the talk here. See if we have these tendencies, if we think about power in this way, just evaluate ourselves, check ourselves. But then there's also other diagnostic as well. It's kind of like getting it's like second MD, right? You know, we're just getting a second opinion on this from other people who see us every day. Awareness and diagnosis is always going to precede the fixing of it. So you can't have one without the other. That's first step.
We had a question back over here, I think. Did you answer it? Okay.
Okay.
So we have one more over on the side.
Over the side? Great.
Wait for the microphone.
Just to piggyback on that, do you know of a 360-degree evaluation tool that's available on the market or through the university even? Or
I will say there's no shortage of consulting companies who develop 360-degree feedback on this. There's a ton of them. The question is are they good assessments? Because you will have all sorts of consultants and others who could sell you on thousands of dollars of 360-degree feedback. What I would like to say is that especially when you're assessing bad boss behaviors and tendencies, one of the best ones in my own personal opinion is the Hogan assessment. Bob Hogan and his late wife developed, they're industrial organizational psychologists, and they developed a very scientifically robust tool for diagnosing bad leadership behaviors. I would suggest that that's one of the first ones, really one of the only ones that I really know of that focuses specifically on bad boss behaviors. You see, you got a lot of them that are like, are you an inspiring leader? Are you this and that? But not enough to kind of get at, are you just a bad boss, right? Being low on a 360-degree feedback on being an inspiring boss is not the same as being verbally abusive or being micromanagement. So that assessment helps assess a little bit more of the dark side of leadership, better than I've seen other scales, and it's very scientifically robust. And that's based on psychometric principles. Now, that's a great way to get out of a conversation, by the way, too. When I teach my students psychometrics, I say, if you're ever at a party and you don't want to talk to anybody, tell them that you're a psychometrician, and they won't ever talk to you again. Okay? That's what the Hogan assessment's based on, psychometrics.
Let me piggyback on that answer as well, because there's this little software program y'all may have heard of called Workday. You might have heard of it, but there is a performance management piece in that also has the ability to get additional feedback from managers and additional reviewers. And as we get further along into the use of Workday and we really discover those tools, I think we're going to find that there's some really cool tools that are available out there in our performance development group, professional development group, because they always work on performance, is working through that right now. And so I know that those guys have some good answers for you. So if you want to reach out to the professional development group within HR, they can also help answer some of those questions. One more question.
So I teach leadership education workshops to the Corps cadets, and we discuss during their second semester of their junior year their leadership constraints and what prevents them from being the amazing leaders that they have the potential to be. And we focus on Flippin's, the Flip Side book, which is an amazing book that will help any individual deeply take a look at their inner selves as who they are as an individual. And you can use this at home, in your workplace, in your social life. So I highly recommend that book.
Great. Thank you. Okay.
I just need to know if the 16-week class you teach, is it available for other people besides students?
The 16-week course I teach is just for students. However, the Center for Executive Development does open enrollment courses, and I do teach in that program. Now, that's going to be like a 2-day, 8 hours a day type of course. We have that brings in staff and faculty and other areas. So if you want to put up with me for 16 more hours, that's available for you as well. So.
Okay, we have one more question in the back, and then that'll be our final question.
I had a question about employees and faculty. If you're experiencing a bad boss, I know you touched on communication, but are there anything as far as environmental or other ways in which the employee can kind of indirectly help that situation or influence that? Is it environmental as well?
Yes, there are ways. In fact, what I would say, and this is, and it's a little bit tricky because we do work in a large organization with a pretty formal bureaucratic structure, as all universities are. There are organizations out there, and this is something you can get from the Bob Sutton book, The No A-Hole Rule, where he talks about that there are some companies who actually put that into formal policy. Formal policy is that you cannot be an a-hole. And they define what an a-hole means, actually, and they write a formal policy on that. That's something that's potentially helpful. I worked with an organization at one point, just talking about environmental things, where the organization actually shifted the way that they awarded bonuses and rewards at the end of the year for their managers. It used to be all based on business results. And then they did a shift and they said 50% of the raise or bonus is going to be based on 360-degree feedback regarding the person's interpersonal skills, and defined very broadly, and 50% is going to be based on formal skills, or on formal business results. That's another way. I'll give you another way too, honestly. In my study, I looked at family problems. We also looked at family-work conflict. In other words, the extent to, and work-family conflict, the extent to which work interferes with family, and found that the more that there's a culture of work interfering with family and vice versa, the more that you are going to have abusive behavior. And so creating family-friendly types of policies can be something that's environmental as well, or having a family-friendly culture. And when I say family, it's defined very broadly, obviously. Non-work really is kind of what we're talking about mostly there. So those are types of things that you can influence environmentally. Let me talk about a last one too. If you want to change the environment, it's always great to have a guiding coalition. Okay? If you're not the only person who's been the brunt of some kind of abusive behavior or micromanagement, the more you get others on your side, the better. I worked with a hospital one time where there was a surgeon who was terribly abusive, notoriously abusive. I won't even go into the stories because it will make you never want to go to a hospital again. And the nurses there actually had a little system they called Code Pink. When this surgeon would begin getting abusive, they would literally surround him in a circle as a show of power against him. And he would stop all of a sudden. And they even had like signs for Code Pink, okay? And it stopped him. Now, that's not evidence-based, okay? But what is evidence-based is that the more you have a coalition, the more you can change an environment to be able to make it more conducive toward positive leadership behaviors. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Courtright.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Doc. Appreciate it.
You know, just listening to our speakers this morning, it became evident to me halfway through his presentation that they're talking about the things that we live in right now, the core values that we have. He's talking about leadership, talking about service, integrity, truth. You know, those are all those things that come together that we believe in, and why people, I think, when they come to Texas A&M University, they go, wow, the people are so friendly here. They care. And that's all those core values that I believe that we all share and that makes this place special. And so again, you know, thank you for what you do here and exhibiting those and bringing those to others who may not have ever had that experience before. So we have one more round of prizes. So everybody get your tickets out. Where'd my ticket prize person go? There it is. What are we gonna do? What do we have?
These are
Green case?
Identity theft, aluminum wallet, coupon wallet.
These three?
We have three, yes.
We're gonna do three? Okay. Identity theft, aluminum wallet, coupon wallet, $5 Starbucks gift card, and a free retirement readiness review meeting, and a Mad Taco $40 gift card. Yeah, there you go. Now we're hitting it. Okay. Now we're talking. Mad Taco. Who would have thought, right? Okay, the lucky winner of the first one is 594. 594. All right. And the winner of the second Mad Taco and all that other stuff, right? Is 743. Over here, all right. Okay, I'm trying. Y'all are looking at me like, why aren't you picking my number? I'm trying.
Here, let me pick your number.
She'll pick your number. Okay. No, that's not it. Number 625. Oh. 625, are they here? Going once, going twice. What? Next room. Nobody, okay. Well, you did so well that one. Here, try another one. Okay. And this one is 396. 396? Okay. So those are the prizes that we have for now. Plenty more for the second half of the day. So if you have signed up for the lunch is in the Gates Ballroom. We ask you to go out the doors, turn right, and come around this side to the Gates Ballroom. If you didn't sign up, you're still welcome to go and have a lunch. So
Tell them we're gonna have new tickets.
we're gonna have new tickets for the afternoon, and we will see you back at 1:30.
Yes, so we're gonna get rid of all these tickets.
Thank you.